2023 was a great year for video games. If you were a Nintendo fan, all year long we were told by these game journalists, by these YouTubers, by these shills that this is one of the best years in gaming ever. We're loaded with major titles like Final Fantasy XVI, Starfield, and Diablo IV, all of which are guaranteed to be huge, massive hits. But in spite of all the publicity, in spite of all the promotion, in spite of all the praise, in spite of all the hype, each and every one of these titles failed. Essentially, this was a year in which the gaming media came out in full force trying to convince you that the Switch is on the way out and the Xbox Series X, the PlayStation 5, and the PC were the platforms to get going forward. That was the narrative. And it collapsed so quickly and so suddenly that a lot of people don't even realize that it has collapsed, right? If you look at what happened during the Game Awards, you saw that all of these great games, all this stuff that the gaming journals assured us were fantastic, were shafted in favor of products that no one has ever heard of or talked about, right? The reality is that these games that used to be the cornerstone of the non-Nintendo industry, that used to be major, that used to be able to be forced onto the general public, that people used to blindly consume just because the media told them to, they're not as popular as they used to be. People are getting bored of them. They're doing other things. They're playing better games. They are not wasting their time with Alan Wake 2 or Marvel Spider-Man 2, right? People have better things to do than to play mediocre games. So today, we're going to be talking about these bad video games. We are going to be talking about each and every major release this year that completely failed. There's I was completely taken aback by the sheer amount of stuff. I had to check my list several times because I forgot several essential entries. This is gonna be a doozy. But now let us begin the Luigis 2023. Alan Wake 2 is one of the most forced, fake popular games I've ever seen in my life. Within the past couple of weeks, a bunch of game journalists came out and declared this to be one of the best games of the year, one of the best stories in gaming, one of the best, some of the best visuals, some of the best artistry, so much creativity, so much going on in this game. Ooh, it's a sequel to a cult classic that we never thought would get made, right? It's such a big deal, right? It's Deadly Premonition 2 all over again. It was a complete joke. There was no enthusiasm for this game. It bombed on release. And other than a handful of meaningless game awards at this year's show, which is one of the major reasons I will never watch or care about the Game Awards ever again, Alan Wake 2 really does demonstrate the problem with the modern video game industry, journalism industry, where they can't critique a product on its own merits. The reason games like this get promoted, they get hyped, is because game journalists desperately want to look deep. They desperately want to look mature. They desperately want to look as if their medium, video games, can make the same kind of artistic, visionary experiences that film can. But in reality, in pursuing the goal of obtaining the status of film, you're losing out on what gives video games their unique identity. This is a mindset I've always had a lot of disdain for, and Alan Wake 2 is simply another example of what went wrong with Naughty Dog and The Last of Us. FromSoft fanboys really want to forget that this was the big Game Awards announcement last year in 2022. Aw man, Armored Core is gonna come back after the success of Elden Ring. This is going to bring Mecha back in full force. It's gonna be this huge deal. It's gonna win Game of the Year because From Software are the best developers in the industry, and Nintendo can't even come close. People forget there was legit discussion about this being the best game of 2023 because FromSoft fanboys are that delusional about the the quality of the company's products. But upon release, the game did middling, and the company declared it a disappointment. It sold like 3 million units. They were expecting Elden Ring numbers, and it can't be more obvious that players came away underwhelmed. All anybody could talk about was like, "Oh, it's so difficult, right, guys?" Which isn't actually true because unlike Dark Souls, which is an action RPG, Armored Core is a mech customization game. So all you have to do to win is just customize your mech. The instant you understand how customizing your mech works and you make one that's adequate for all situations, you're just gonna breeze through the game. Like, there's a reason why the people who were memeing about how difficult the game was gonna be kind of faded away the instant the game actually came out. Once it, once the game proved itself to not be all that impressive. It was kind of amusing to see because I think this kind of proves my point when I talk about my criticisms of FromSoft as a company. They really cannot, absolutely cannot, deviate from the Souls formula whatsoever. Every single time they're going to fall flat on their face. The only reason this got as much publicity as it did was because it was a pre existing IP and because people were getting burned out on Souls games. Armored Core 6 was never going to be successful. It was never going to be popular. It was never going to bring Mecha back. Like no matter how much Jeff Keighley tried to shill it, despite like trashing Armored Core 4 back when it came out in 2008, in spite of this game's failure, it's been really interesting seeing people try and pass this game off as a success or that it spells good things for FromSoft. It really doesn't. This is, I think, a kind of a sign that we are nearing the beginning of the end. Nobody wants to see anything from FromSoft other than Souls, and there will come a time where people burn out on that as well. Does anyone even remember Exoprimal? This is such an interesting release to me because when it was first shown off, people were getting excited because, of course, like, oh, it's Capcom. It has dinosaurs. This must be the new Dino Crisis thing. Ooh, I love old IPs from PlayStation that nobody else cares about. I know people who just obsess about these mediocre IPs because they just have nothing else to play. Right. What it all comes down to is that third parties, the companies that make up the backbone of PlayStation and Xbox development, the companies that have neglected and ignored Nintendo for the past 30 years, have been deified by the gaming public so much that even mediocre Resident Evil knockoffs like Dino Crisis have followings, right? And that sometimes leads to like relatively positive things from these companies like Devil May Cry 5 exploding in popularity because nothing else came out that year. But on the flip side of that, what's happening increasingly is that when a company does try to do something different, when they try to be original, when they try to come up with a new IP, nobody really cares about it because all anybody could think when they saw this was like, I'd rather it be a Dino Crisis game. Like, just slap the Dino Crisis label on it, and I think a lot more people would have been more enthusiastic. Like, they wouldn't even have to change anything, right? Just say they modernized it or something. And it's kind of pathetic, honestly, that the instant that people realized this wasn't a Dino Crisis game, it completely fell off the radar, right? Nobody cared about how bad it was. Nobody cared about like just how contrived it was, the poor gameplay, just like everything they did. Like this is probably low key one of the worst releases of the year. And yet everybody just memory hold it because you can't let Capcom look bad. They're one of PlayStation's best partners right now, and they desperately need to promote Monster Hunter Wilds and Dragon's Dogma 2, right? Those are some of the only games that anybody is really looking forward to. And the fact that like bombs like this come out all the time from every major studio and nobody wants to talk about it is a really strong indication of just how precarious of a position the gaming industry actually is right now. Ever since Toby Fox got away with ripping off a bunch of classic 90s JRPGs with Undertale, it feels like every no name indie dev in the industry has been trying to replicate that phenomenon, completely unaware that Toby is only popular because of his legacy as working at Homestuck and what that fan base and like that it really had nothing to do with Undertale at all. But for a very brief period of time, people were really, really trying to convince you that Pizza Tower was a masterpiece. This blatant Wario Land clone that failed to do anything unique or interesting or improve on the formula at all. It's just a copycat. There's nothing original or fresh or exciting here. It is the mighty number nine of Wario Land games, right? And I know plenty of people who hype this game up as a gem, that it's one of the best games that came out this year. Like people who legit were pushing it for game of the year, and I the entire concept was just ridiculous to me. Like, come on, like have some real standards, guys. Play some real video games. For whatever reason, Baldur's Gate 3 has spawned an audience that is completely delusional about its success. These people think this is one of the best games of the year, that it has all these innovative, amazing gameplay elements, that it's some spectacular thing, but in actuality, it's a niche product that nobody outside of their core D&D demographic really knows anything or cares about. The fact that this game could win the Game of the Year award and get like no hype or discussion at all, what ended up happening instead is that people just made fun of Starfield, Harry Potter, Zelda, and Spider-Man instead, right? The discussion regarding this product never had anything to do with itself, right? It never really stood on its own feet. When it got a 96 on Metacritic, all anybody could do was just brag about how it was better than Zelda, right? Like all they could do was just compare it to other games. But in reality, I've never heard anyone describe the experience of playing Baldur's Gate 3. I've never heard anyone do a good job explaining what makes the game compelling, right? Everything I've heard sounds dumb and lame as all out. If anything, this reminds me a lot of Skyrim or Fallout New Vegas, right? Mid-Western RPGs that were pushed to the forefront at the time because there was really nothing else like them on the market. And I think that's what this all boils down to. There is no competition. It was so weird to me going into the Diablo 4 hype cycle just how much enthusiasm there was for it. This is, of course, the first mainline Diablo game after Diablo 3, and the one that immediately follows the insanely controversial Diablo Immortal. And the narrative going into this was that this is going to fix all the problems that Blizzard has had over the past couple of years. This is going to be an amazing game. It's not going to be always online. It's gonna fix the marketplace problems. It's gonna be an amazing experience. Like Blizzard is back, baby. It I suppose I personally saw through it, but it really felt like for a while there that there was going to be some kind of momentum behind the game, that it was going to be a hit among some people, but the majority of the audience dropped this game after a couple of weeks. We're at the point now where even the most hardcore Diablo fans on the planet are not sticking with the IP anymore. The glory days of Diablo 2 are over. They're long gone. They are not coming back. And Blizzard has not been able to retain the audience in any meaningful way. And as a result of that, more and more we're seeing the audience reject what Blizzard is putting out. Not just with Diablo, but with other like forced AstroTurf projects. Stuff like Overwatch, stuff like World of Warcraft, stuff like Hearthstone, all this stuff that was objectively terrible, but was pushed to the forefront because Blizzard had such a dedicated following that was just obsessed with them because they were the only relevant PC gaming studio for a very, very long time. Blizzard was never a good developer, and I will be very glad to see them go. One of the more baffling things to come from this year's Game Awards, and my personal reason why I will no longer be supporting them going forward, was the blatant and irresponsible shilling for CD Projekt Red and Cyberpunk 2077. This game was always supposed to be the next big thing. It was supposed to be the game that would kick off the next generation. It was supposed to be the next BioWare, the next Bethesda. It was supposed to usher in a new age of Western video game open world RPGs. This was supposed to be a big deal. And this game was a complete and total failure. And we are still in this weird period where CD Projekt Red is struggling to regain their credibility, trying to fix the game, trying to get people to like it, and it just isn't panning out very well. Nobody really cares. They released a DLC expansion this year, and nobody bought or played it. It's honestly kind of embarrassing. But what's worse about this is just how much the gaming media is trying to convince us that this is a fixed product, that CD Projekt Red has come back and saved the game from irrelevancy. That is never, ever going to happen. I gave an extremely negative review to Pikmin 4 when it first came out, and after going back and playing Pikmin 1 and Pikmin 3 again, especially Pikmin 3, I've really come to appreciate just how much better those games actually are than this nonsense. There is no strategy, there is no depth, there are creative aspects to the game, but they don't mesh very well. This is such an underwhelming entry to the series that I honestly am not optimistic about the future of the franchise going forward. This was a huge disappointment. I've always been a very big fan of the original Octopath Traveler. I saw it as the last gasp of relevancy from old Squaresoft. It felt like a bunch of people who grew up playing classic Squaresoft RPGs finally came together and put out something really unique and special that harkened back to games like Final Fantasy VI, right? Octopath Traveler was a very, very great breath of fresh air from the company, and a big part of that was how unique the game was. Its unique low fantasy setting, its focus on turn-based combat, and its unique eight character system with each with their own unique storylines that all have radically different tones and just go showcase the world from different perspectives. It really made the world feel alive and lived in spite of its low budget. And when I saw the sequel was coming out, I was disappointed right off the bat, right? It looked to be a complete rehash. It looked like what people were saying that Tears of the Kingdom was going to end up being like. This looked terrible. And although eventually I decided to try the game because they put a great emphasis on emphasizing that, like, oh, the characters are going to be way different, like each class is going to have a way different storyline than they did in the original, right? The game's going to be different. Like, actually playing the game, you're experienced with worse sprite work, worse music, worse storylines that are filled with plot holes, even in like the first chapter of the game, less likable characters, less memorable situations, and it all just erupts into this situation where it feels like the game is unfinished. And to a certain extent, I felt the same way about Triangle Strategy, which I liked a lot more than this. Uh, but like, it really does feel as if Square Enix is simply not capable of producing games like this anymore. It feels more and more that this game was
didn't get the time and attention it deserved to really work. And I think that's what's really frustrating about this is that at its core, this game should be great. This game should have been able to follow up on the original and do something unique and interesting, but it didn't. It completely failed at that. As a fan of these games, I will tell you, I consider Triangle Strategy to be the real sequel to Octopath Traveler. It has the same kind of vibe to it. It's a throwback to classic strategy RPGs like Final Fantasy Tactics and Ogre Battle. This is just a worse version of Octopath Traveler. Like 100-hour long game whose primary appeal is for people who are looking for unique, fresh JRPG experiences. This game, I feel, has no audience. Starfield! I remember when people were giving me flack for saying this game was going to be a failure and a disappointment. And now, seeing just how quickly it's dropped off, how nobody really cares about it, how people who gave it middling scores are saying it's even worse now that they've played it more and more. Now that, like, Bethesda's marketing budget has run out, now that the audience is, what it feels like is that Bethesda's star has fallen, right? The company that rose to prominence by releasing Skyrim, which a lot of people thought was a fresh, unique RPG experience, it wasn't, has released a product that is so alien, so boring, so lifeless that even the most hardcore of shills are having problems defending it, right? When you look at everything this game does, when you look at its scope, when you look at how long it took to produce, when you look at like how this was, how hyped this was, even as early as like the beginning of this year, when you look at like just how many people threw this out there as a game of the year contender, right? Like who really thought this game was going to be something special. Like it's remarkable just how quickly this thing fell off once it came out. And this just goes to show you just how incapable the Western video game industry seems to be when it comes to like retaining talent and continuing producing hits. Like it's so strange to me that the first new major IP from Bethesda since Skyrim has flopped this way. I don't think people understand what a big deal that is that Bethesda has failed to produce a follow-up to Skyrim. You know, New Vegas didn't do well, Fallout 76 didn't do well, Starfield didn't do well. What's going to happen if the Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't do as well as Starfield? Like what happens if like Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't do well? Right? Bethesda, I think, is on the fast track to becoming irrelevant. They are going to get like BioWared, where like nobody talks about them, nobody acknowledges them at all. And there's a lot of things to be said about that, but I do think this is the current state of the industry now, where a lot of these major names that people throw around as major reasons to own non-Nintendo platforms are becoming uncompetitive. There is no denying that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was far superior to Skyrim, to Starfield in every way, shape, and form, but you certainly won't see a lot of people admitting it because acknowledging that fact would be very embarrassing to Bethesda and to their parent company, Microsoft. A remake of Resident Evil 4, one of the best Nintendo games of all time. Right? This was supposed to be a big deal. This was supposed to bring Resident Evil 4 back to the consoles that it should have released on to begin with. This was going to be the hardcore game. It was not going to be the kiddie RE4 that like we Nintendo babies grew up with. No, this was going to be a man's RE4. This was going to be realistic. This was going to be gritty. This was going to be a major improvement. It was going to get rid of sex jokes. It was going to get rid of everything that made the original problematic. Everybody is going to be speaking proper Spanish. Following on the success of Resident Evil 2 Remake, people were already speculating that like RE4 remake was in production, right? And that was kind of the excuse people gave for like Resident Evil 3 remake for being so terrible, was that like, well, they're focusing on 4. But, now that 4 is out, we can safely say that like, wow, this wasn't very good either. Like you can tell, the developers don't understand the tone of RE4. They couldn't convert it into a proper horror game. They couldn't make it interesting. Like in general, it feels like these new line of Resident Evil remakes have been failures. The vastly overhyped Resident Evil 2 just wasn't nearly as good as the vast majority of audiences made it out to be. And I think with each iterative, with each sequel, that we've seen this become more and more played out. We're seeing more and more people get tired of it. To the point where where people started talking about the Resident Evil 5 remake when this came out, like everybody just kind of laughed about it. Like, yeah, nobody cares. Like, even if it comes out, nobody's gonna buy it. It's over. Capcom is becoming more and more reliant on these kind of remakes to keep themselves relevant. So this might be the last time Resident Evil is really talked about in any meaningful capacity. It's really interesting. Fighting games feel like they're in the middle of a dark age because nobody wants to play them. They have no content. The skill ceiling is too complicated to bust through. All anybody wants to do is play ranked. It just feels as if the genre doesn't appeal to anyone other than like the most hardcore of spurgs, right? When you really look at the fighting game community, the only people who care about this stuff are hardcore fans. And more casual players are being alienated by just the culture and just the inaccessibility of learning how to play these games. And I think Street Fighter 6 is a really good example of that. Even if the game itself is mechanically good, it has no content. It has no replay value for casual players. Nobody cares about the characters or the world or the setting or the single player, right? It's all about just being better than the other person. And it's very, very difficult to get into. I completely forgot they tried to release The Last of Us Part 1 this year. I forgot that they re-released this thing and that everybody made fun of it. Apparently everyone else forgot it too, because I haven't seen anyone make fun of this since it first came out. But yeah, Naughty Dog seriously tried to release The Last of Us Part 1 again. And it was such a joke because this game was never good, but Naughty Dog, PlayStation, and the gaming industry has desperately been trying to push this as like a cornerstone of video game storytelling when in reality I wouldn't even call it mid. Right? This game is just pure trash. It is the most goy of slops, right? It is just terrible all around. It's terrible. And more, I hope people start realizing this. I hope people start realizing that Naughty Dog is not a talented studio, that these games aren't fun, the stories aren't engaging. But until that happens, we're just going to have to keep making fun of this game every single time it gets re-released. The Mortal Kombat 1 situation is a lot more interesting to me than the Street Fighter 6 one because I think, unlike most fighting game IPs, Mortal Kombat actually managed to strike a really good balance between competitive play and more casual play. Right? They had the story mode and a wide range of activities for casual players while still having ranked and online play for more competitive stuff. It appealed to both audiences, and as a result of that, weirdly enough, this was my favorite fighting game IP in recent years. But that's all changed over the past couple of entries. The games have been getting worse. The writing has been degrading. The story has not been advancing in any meaningful way. Characters have not been evolving. The plots aren't becoming more engaging. It just is really becoming generic DC slop, right down to the whole multiverse plot point, right? Like the instant I heard that word, multiverse, I just completely lost interest. Because you know what that means. It means there are no stakes. There's nothing to be invested in. Like, ooh, everything is possible in the multiverse. Like, no. You can't just do that. It doesn't make any sense at all. And the fact that like so many franchises have to lean on this kind of concept in order to keep like their stories going perpetually is just embarrassing. What they should have done is just stuck with what they did with 10, right? Is introduce a new generation of characters and slowly start building them up over a series of games instead of just replacing them all with 11 in 11. It's just like 10 had a great cast. Whatever problems that game had, it had the right idea of knowing that the franchise's roster has been played out since the original games and that they really needed to evolve and do something else. But one is just keeping the same cast of characters with no real growth or evolution. Like, if I wanted to play with the same cast of characters, I would just pop in Mortal Kombat 9 again. I don't need this. Hogwarts Legacy is interesting because it's undoubtedly the highest grossing game this year. It's the highest selling game. It outsold Call of Duty. Really interested in at least trying the product out. Now, I was sure it wouldn't be good. I was sure they would like get lore details wrong, which they did. I was sure they would like mess up the timeline or the continuity or like do some weird anachronistic thing, like the whole diversity thing in 1800s Hogwarts, right? Like, I was sure they were going to do something like that, right? And eventually I ended up, like, not getting the game, right? Because it was just too much, right? When you look at what they tried to do here with the story, with, like, the themes, like, the ideas, like, it's the same problem that a lot of Harry Potter follow-up material has had, where a lot of them do not want to acknowledge the implications of what's actually happening, right? So when you have like, say, the background, right, of wizards versus goblins, right? Like you can't possibly portray goblins as being in the wrong ever, right? It has to be this case where like, oh, the wizards did this because wizards are evil because like wizards are supposed to be the privileged class. They're supposed to be like the white people equivalent of the setting, right? So instead of like creating like this fantasy race with this like unique kind of role in the world and like this unique relationship with like the main characters, like you have to do this weird thing where you have to pretend they never do anything wrong. And it just doesn't work. It is a complete joke. It's interesting to see Spider-Man 2 fail the way it did. The original was overhyped, primarily because it came out at the height of Marvel's popularity, but it's been 5 years since then, right? The Marvel thing is dead. Nobody cares about the films anymore. The characters are less popular than ever. People are starting to be cringed by, to find this stuff cringy. And Spider-Man 2 is definitely caught in the middle of that. Hardcore fans are put off by the lore changes and the ridiculous story decisions. From what I've seen, it's some of the worst like writing in any video game I've seen in recent years. I'm told it's like basically a walking simulator if you just stick with like the story missions. The shilling for Miles Morales and Mary Jane is obnoxious. Venom is like Harry Osborn apparently. Even I, who have never been a big Spider-Man fan, know how ridiculous that is. Like, it feels like Insomniac simply doesn't understand what makes Spider-Man appealing to people, and if they are failing to make Spider-Man products that work. Game of the Year 2023. I know this came out in January and nothing else has come out yet, but Hi-Fi Rush is one of the best games of the year. What a joke. Like, I found that so cringy when people started coming out with this line. It was obviously like a very blatant viral marketing campaign by Microsoft. You know, they had paid shills go on YouTube and 4chan promoting this game for a couple of weeks after it came out. Oh, it stealth launched on Steam for $30 out of nowhere? Whoa, no company has ever done anything like that before. Like, the game was billed as being like an offbeat, kind of different action game, right? Something that Xbox wouldn't normally be involved in, right? Kind of like Sunset Overdrive and stuff like that. And every time they do this, like, their attempts just kind of fall flat, right? Like, the game is made by people who have backgrounds at like Clover and Platinum Games, who have a portfolio of games that are way better than this. The main reason people talked about it was primarily because, like, oh, there's nothing else like it. Bro, if you've played Clover games, if you played Platinum games, you've played better action games than this. Like, this game is not special. And that was kind of my problem with it, is just the blatant treatment of this as if it was some phenomenal thing when really it was just an action game that came out on a console that doesn't typically have action games like it, right? It is a game that was quickly forgotten, and this time next year nobody will even remember that it even exists. $100 million, right? One of the biggest failures of the year for sure. A game that I think legit might actually sink Square Enix long term. Like, Forspoken was a disaster from the onset, right? Attempting to pander to woke United States audiences, Square Enix produced this game and tried to cater to what game journalists said they wanted, with like a black woman protagonist in a fantasy setting. And what happens? Nobody buys it. Nobody finds it appealing. Nobody finds it interesting. And above all, most importantly, it's not a very good game. And it's such a shame too, because I kind of like the idea of Square Enix making this like isekai like thing, but like, yeah, there is no denying that they completely botched this release. Dead Space was always one of the more overrated franchises of yesteryear. I remember when people were hyping this up as one of the best horror games ever made, and today how everyone just kind of agrees that Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil Remake were better. But with the remake, a lot of secondaries, people like Angry Joe who never played the original, they're doing the exact same thing, pretending as if this remake is something spectacular, when in reality, it's not impressive, it's not fresh, it's not original, it's not different. It's not even the best remake that came out around the same time. Metroid Prime Remastered was better. So yeah, Dead Space was a complete joke. Hated the shilling for it. People really need to stop giving EA credit whenever they put something like this out, because this really is the best they can possibly manage. Acquire a studio and then re-release their game through a remake.
Although Forspoken was a much more notorious flop and a game that everyone had a lot of great issues with, Final Fantasy 16, I think, is going to be the release that does more long term damage for the company. Not the least of which being the fact that it wasn't able to recoup the costs lost by Forspoken. This was supposed to be the next major Final Fantasy game. This was supposed to be a PlayStation 5 seller. This was supposed to be a phenomenon. This was supposed to be the next big thing. And all that happened was that this game came out and it just was completely forgotten. People who played it have nothing nice to say about it, but they were few and far between. Like the vast majority of the demographics had no interest in this release at all. This game appealed to no one. It didn't appeal to Final Fantasy fans. It didn't appeal to action fans. It didn't appeal to anyone. And Square Enix still refuses to acknowledge the very real problems that have been plaguing their studio over the past year, to the point where, like, I honestly, looking at this list, they're probably the worst publisher this year, considering the sheer amount of stuff they put out that I just cannot stand. This was a straight up embarrassment, and I just feel as if not enough people are really addressing the fact that, like, there is no recovery for this. Right now, people are trying to like create this narrative that Zelda is on the way out and like Tears of the Kingdom was a failure and that like nobody likes open world Zelda, which is all obviously not true, but in reality, Final Fantasy 16 is right there. Plays nothing like the old games, looks nothing like the old games, appeals to no one who likes the old games, and yet it's being completely ignored, right? It is not getting the same kind of criticisms in spite of having way more problems and it just objectively failing, right? This was a failure. And I just don't understand why so many people are so obsessed with remaining in denial about that.